So what we're doing today is we're learning how to create a closed workflow for our quotes. Now this closed workflow can be applied to our quotes, pull sheets, invoices. And what this closed workflow will do is literally close out any old jobs. For example, if we go to projects and we go to projects quotes and open up our quotes here, if we haven't closed out any quotes, we're going to have every quote we've ever created in here. And this could be, hundreds of pages, thousands of quotes that are loading. We can see that in our start and end dates, we're loading quotes from 2014, early 2015, and this really bogs down your system. So we're going to go ahead and create a workflow that's going to close out all these old quotes. Now, this also affects if we're in our resource browser and we're searching quotes or invoices. When we go to search for something in this resource browser, it's also filtering through all of these quotes that are open. So it really just kind of bogs down the system when you don't have a closed workflow. So today we're going to create that closed workflow. And just a little note, our closed workflow is not the same as deleting a quote. When we go to projects and quotes, we have our cogwheel in the top right that we can select, and you can see that we can include closed quotes. And that's a different action than deleting a quote. And so this doesn't actually delete the quote. What it does is it moves the quote into a closed status. So when you go to projects and quotes, you'll still be able to include closed quotes and reference any closed quotes. You'll still be able to copy it and just be able to open it. And we'll look at the status option here that we have for closed to see if you can edit it or not. And that's all configurable, but it's not the same as a deleted quote. And so we're going to go ahead and go to System Settings and Status Options. And the first thing we're going to do is make sure that we have a closed status. We can't create our closed workflow without having a closed status. Now, you should have a closed status in there by default. If not, we can easily create that by going to New Status option. We're going to name it Closed. And the one setting you want to be sure that you check here is closed status is going to be yes. And that's what this whole status is for, is making sure that it's a closed status. So we're going to leave creates conflicts as no and locks availability as no because we're just moving it into a closed status. Again, this is going to be for jobs that we're done with, old jobs. We're going to be moving that into a closed status. So we would create that. And if you already have this closed status, we can double check those settings. And lock status just determines whether when you open that it's locked or not, and whether you can make changes. And I'll leave that up to you guys, but we want to make sure that closed status is yes, create conflicts is no, and locks availability is no. Once we set that, we're going to go ahead and update just to make sure all those settings save. Now that we have a closed status, we can continue doing a closed workflow. And to do that, we're going to go to Projects and Workflow. And this is where all the workflows live for all of our elements. As you can see, we have our event workflow, invoice, pull sheet. Right now, we're going to focus on the quote workflow and creating a closed workflow for the quote. So we're going to open this up by double-clicking. And the first thing we want to do, if you look at, we have workflow state, with the workflow state list, and then we have our actions columns. Now our workflow state is essentially the status that it's going to live in. So a confirmed state is a confirmed status. If you look at the status options, they correlate with each other. So this canceled workflow state is going to be a canceled workflow status. And so the first thing we need to do is create a closed state in order for our quotes to be moved into. To do that, we're going to click on the new workflow state. We're going to name this closed. And in our status options here, we're going to make sure this is going to a closed status. We're going to click create. Now, when we reload this quote workflow tab, we will have a closed status. And again, we can double check, or a closed state, and we can double check we have our closed state and it correlates to the closed status. Now, creating the state alone won't actually allow you to move this element into a closed state. That's where the workflow actions come in. These actions are quite literally a button that moves, so it's an action, it moves this element into the state of the button you're clicking on. So if we go and open a confirmed quote, this is what appears in our quote under workflow. These are the workflow actions. We can see that when we're in a confirmed state, we have these actions available. And these actions are what show up when I'm in a confirmed quote, and I have those same actions available. So now we have our closed workflow state, but we need an action to move this element into the closed workflow state. Now, if you're invoicing in our system, I'm going to suggest, and this is how we're going to do it right now, is moving this closed, or putting this closed workflow action into the invoice created state. Because again, we're using this closed action and this closed workflow to close out older quotes or quotes that are complete. Now, to create a workflow action, we're going to click New Workflow Action. We're going to name this Close Quote, and this name is what appears on the actual quote. When we open a quote and go to the workflow, that name is exactly what's going to appear as the workflow action. So I'm going to name this Close Quote because that's what I want the action to be named. That's what I want to appear when I'm actually on a quote. This confirm screen enabled, if we have it set to yes, which I suggest setting it to yes for a closed quote, it's going to pop up a screen and say, are you sure you want to move this into a closed state? And I'm just going to set it to yes because since we're closing a quote, it's not, we just want to make sure that it's not clicked accidentally, or, that we're not closing quotes we don't need to. So it's just kind of a second check to make sure that this is what you want to do. The next actions we have are source state and our target state. Your source state is where this action is going to be coming from. So right now, all we've done is we clicked New Workflow Action, but we haven't told it from which state this is going to appear in. So the source state is going to be what state is this action going to show up in. And right now we're going to do it in the invoice created state. So the source state is going to be invoice created. This means that when we're in the invoice created state, we will have this action, the close quote action, available. Our target state is always going to be what the action carries this element into. So that means when we're invoice created, this close quote action is going to appear, and our target state means that it's going to move this quote into what state. Here is where we're going to choose our newly created closed workflow state. So again, you have your closed action. Your source state is what state or what status do I want this action to appear in, and your target state is where do I want this action to move this element into. You're going to click create, and we'll go back to our workflow, our quote workflow, and reload. And here you'll notice that in invoice created, we now have that close quote workflow action available. Now this means when I go to projects and quotes, if I have a quote that's in the invoice created state, when I go down to my workflow, I now have this close quote action available to me that will move this quote into a closed state and status. So that's the gist of setting up a closed workflow. Now we've only added the closed workflow action to this invoice created state. The nice thing with workflow actions is you can add them to multiple states. So with this closed quote action, if we want to be able to close the quote after it's been shipped, or even after it's been confirmed, or even after it's been canceled, we can add that workflow action to any of these workflow states. And I'm just going to add it to one more state here to show you an example. So we're going to create this new workflow action. And actually first, I'm going to go ahead and just open up a quote that's confirmed. And you can see that right now, when we're in a confirmed quote, we don't have the closed quote action available. So again, I'm going to projects, workflow. We're going to look at the quote workflow. And here I'm going to add this closed quote action to another workflow state. So I'm going to click new workflow action. I'm going to name it closed quote. And typically you want to keep it, if you're doing the same workflow action and adding it to another state, you want to make sure that it's the same name. Especially if it's performing the same action, even if it's going to a different state, you want to make sure that it's the same name. And again, our source state is going to be the source that this action, or the state that this action is going to appear in. So right now we're going to add this action to a confirmed state. So that means that when we're in a confirmed state, this action will appear. And our target state is the end state or status that we want this quote to be moved into. So we're saying from this, we can click this action and move it into this state, which is going to be a closed state. I'm going to create this, go back to my quote workflow, reload this, and now we can see that that closed action was added to the confirmed workflow state. Now if we go back to the quote that's in a confirmed status, before I reload it, we're just going to double check, and there is no closed action. Now after we've created the workflow action to be in the confirmed state, I'm going to reload this quote. And again, we're still in a confirmed status. But now when I scroll down to my workflow, I have the ability to close this quote. We have our workflow confirmation that I set up. and this will allow me to move this quote into a closed quote. Also, now that we've created this workflow action and the closed workflow, we can go back to projects and quotes, and we can filter these by the status of where we put this closed workflow action in. So if you want to do it off the original, where we added the closed quote action to the invoice created state, we can go to projects, quotes. We can filter our quotes by status, and we're looking at invoice created. Now from here, I can close the quote. And that way I don't have to open up each one individually. I now have that workflow action available to me from this status. So now we can close out all our old quotes. And once we do that, right now we're looking at quotes. Once we close that out, when we go back to load this screen, projects, quotes, whatever we've closed out will not load by default. And now when we go to our search bar over here in our resource browser, when we start searching for a quote, whatever we've closed out will not be added to this to filter through. So it makes it a lot quicker for searching and opening quotes. We can also go filter this by confirmed, since we added the closed workflow action to the confirmed state. We can filter by confirmed quotes and also close out quotes. So whatever state that you've added this closed workflow action to, you'll be able to go to projects, quotes, filter that status that you added the closed workflow action to, and be able to just close these out. Now, we've looked at how to do this to a quote, but you can also do this to other project elements. So you can do this same workflow to an invoice. You can do it to pull sheets, manifests. Right now, let's go ahead and do it to an invoice, and it's going to be the exact same steps. The only difference, I'm going to close these out, is we're going to go to projects, workflow, and again, because this is where all the workflows live, now we're going to open up our invoice workflow. By default, we have only two statuses. We're going to add a new state. We're going to call this closed. And I'll just do closed invoice for a little bit of transparency here. And this is going to move into a closed status. We're going to create this. Now, when we reload this invoice workflow tab, we have a closed status. Now the next thing we need to do is the exact same steps that we did for our quote. We need to create a new workflow action called close invoice. Our source date is going to be invoice paid, because we're saying when we're in this state, this action is going to be available, and it's going to move us into our target state, which is a closed invoice. I'm going to create this, go back to my invoice workflow, and now we have a closed invoice action in our invoice paid state. Now, one thing I recommend is when we have a closed invoice or closed state, is that we add actions to get out of this state. So we want to do this on any element, whether it be a quote, an invoice, pull sheet, or manifest, any element that we create a closed workflow state. You want to create actions to back out of that state, because right now we can go into our workflow, gets us into a closed state, but it doesn't get us out of it. So what we're going to do is create a new workflow action, and we're going to call this reset to paid. You can name it reopen quote if you're doing this for the quote, or reopen invoice. What we're going to do is say our source state is going to be closed invoice this time. It's not going to be our target state, because we want it to be when we're in this state, we want this action to become available. Now our target state is going to be where we want it to reopen to. What state do we want this to reopen as? And since I'm naming this reset to paid, we want our target state to be the invoice paid state. Now when we create this, we're going to go back to our workflow, our invoice workflow. Now when we're in a closed state, we have the ability to reopen this or reset it to an invoice being paid. And this kind of closes our loop and gives us a complete full circle of our workflow. And we can do the same thing we did in our quotes. If we go to projects, invoices, we can now filter out by status any invoice. We can filter out by the status that we added the workflow action to. In this case, it was invoice paid. We added the closed action to it. So we can go to projects, invoices, filter out by paid invoices, and be able to close out those invoices, follow up that workflow from here. That way we're not having to open each one individually. Now, I'm just going to touch on this real quick before we end. One thing you guys probably saw that I haven't talked about much, and I'm just going to mention this, is our chained actions. If we go to projects, workflow, and then we open up a workflow. Let's go to our quote workflow. We can open up the actions that we created. So I'm going to open up the close quote action, and we do that by just clicking the action. One thing we saw is our chained parent actions and our chained child actions. Now what these do is these will say, if I select a chained child action, is when we click this action, we want this to happen to child items. So here we can say we want our pull sheet, because a pull sheet is a child item of, or let's do invoice. An invoice is a child item of a quote. We can say when we've clicked the close quote button, we want this chain child action to find the invoice and close the invoice as well. Now this only works if you've created this same workflow on another element. The reason I'm able to do it to the invoice is because we went to our projects workflow, we opened up our invoice workflow, and we added a closed state and a closed action to our invoice workflow. Now because of that, I can add that invoice workflow close invoice as a chain child action. And I just wanted to mention that we do have another video on our YouTube channel that goes over that more in depth, but I did want to mention that since it came up. And then we also have a video that goes over the inflow and outflow jobs. And the outflow jobs are actions that appear when you close a quote. and this could be emails that pop up to get sent out, etc. And we do have another video that goes over that, but I just wanted to touch on that real quick. So that concludes the end of this webinar, and I'll go ahead and answer any questions.